Okay, hello. Oh, and right. Here we go. Hello. Thank you all for joining us today. This webinar is brought to you by a grant from the New York Farm Viability Institute and the New York Corn and Soybean Growers Association. This webinar is part of a series of discussions focusing on farming in a changing climate in New York. There will be another webinar planned for December. I don't have a date yet, or January, but we are planning those. So look for announcements for these events coming soon. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Genesee River Demonstration Farm Network webpage. So if you want to watch this later, just type in Genesee Demo Farm Network and you will be directed to the page and you'll see a link for it there. Today we are joined by Dr. Debbie Aller, who is an Extension Associate at Cornell University. She conducts applied research trials and extension activities focused on improving soil health across farms in New York and beyond. Before joining the New York Soil Health Program, she worked directly with the Long Island agricultural community to reduce nutrient and pesticide inputs from farmland by encouraging the adoption of best management practices and regenerative agriculture principles. It is a pleasure to welcome Debbie to share her perspective on what biochar is, where it is the most effective in its application, and potential challenges to widespread adoption in New York State. Thank you, Debbie.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron, for the introduction and inviting me to give a presentation and be here with you all this morning. Nice and early, and everyone's still enjoying their coffee, including myself. So hopefully you can hear me, and see my slides all right. And Aaron, you started the recording, which is great. Okay. All right. So Aaron had asked me a number of weeks ago to give basically a background or an introduction on biochar and its overall application and potential use within New York State agriculture. This was kind of sparked by, well, a number of conversations we've had over like the years around biochar, but then also much more recently during our Soil Health and Climate Resilient Field Day series. In a field day, we partnered with American Farmland Trust and a number of other folks on out in Western New York. And there I was just giving a talk on soil health and climate resiliency and mentioned biochar, and suddenly a bunch of hands went up and there was just a lot of conversation around it, a lot of interest, a lot of questions. And so hopefully this presentation today will clarify some of those basic questions around biochar and its potential use, and then probably open up the door for a whole number of other questions from folks. And so this is really a general overview. I will be spanning a multitude of topics, from what is biochar all the way to kind of some tools and more recent technological developments around it. See if this works. Okay. So really just to start basically of what biochar is. And at its highest level, it's a solid co-product of biomass pyrolysis. A number of years ago, it was really looked at as a byproduct. It was not seen as having any value, and it was kind of the waste stream of the pyrolysis process, which through pyrolysis produces liquid, solids, and gas, as you can see in the figure there. So pyrolysis is simply the thermochemical decomposition of biomass, and we're talking about any organic material. And in the case of biochar, we're really focusing on organic waste material or very low quality materials being used to produce biochar. And this is produced at high temperatures. Typically we see over 350 degrees Celsius, probably over about 500 degrees Celsius is better there, and it's really the absence of oxygen. So we're not getting combustion like we get in something like a cook stove or a campfire, but without oxygen is critical within the pyrolysis process, or we can say very, very low oxygen conditions. And so through pyrolysis, we start with feedstock. So often many people hear the term feedstock, and this is really the starting material for biochar. It's that organic waste material through pyrolysis we get those three end products. And obviously today I'm going to be talking about the solid product being biochar, but the liquids can go to things like bioasphalt and other bio-based products. And the gases, which are called syngas, often will go back to the grid and can be used as electricity or for energy production. And so just a little bit, not to bore you with chemistry at 8 a.m., but I think this is important just to mention about biochar, is what kind of fundamentally happens during pyrolysis. And we start with hemicellulose, cellulose, lignin, the three basic building blocks of most of woody materials. And through pyrolysis, what happens is this condensation of these structures to a more aromatic, a condensed aromatic structure. And you'll notice in my next few slides, as I talk about this really has to do with that stability and that kind of long-term resistance to decomposition of biochar in the soil. And the reason why biochar is different than raw organic materials, things like compost or raw wood chips or mulches or things like this. And so it's that condensation of those aromatic or the carbon structures into aromatic bonds that makes it more resistant to degradation. And so more simply put around what biochar is it is a charcoal-like material. It's different than charcoal, as I'm going to explain in my next slide, but it looks like charcoal. It feels like charcoal to some extent, but it has many versatile applications. And it's produced, as I mentioned before, from organic waste materials. And this is really important. We're not talking about cutting down trees or using crop residues that would otherwise have beneficial purposes within the environment that they're coming from. We're looking at materials that would otherwise be disposed of or we're potentially paying to get rid of. And these may include manures, sewage sludges, woody biomass materials, dedicated bioenergy crops, something like willow, switchgrass, materials that are purposely grown to be used for bioenergy production. So any organic waste material. And biochar itself is about 50 to 90% carbon. This ranges. There are lower ones, there are higher ones, but that at the basic structure, it's about 50 to 90% carbon. So it's incredibly carbon-rich material, and it's incredibly highly porous. And this is critical when we think about water and nutrient retention, especially in terms of its application to the soil environment. So we can think of biochar on a microscopic level as a sponge in it. It has micro, meso, and macro pores. And so it has kind of a spongy structure. And this recalcitrance that I just mentioned, which I'll mention in a few more slides down below. And biochar really is a soil conditioner or soil amendment. It is not a pesticide. It is not a fertilizer, although there's discussion, which I'll talk about today, on some bio-based fertilizers. But in terms of speaking about it, it is an amendment or conditioner, and that's how it should be referred. And so the difference between char, charcoal, and biochar, I'd just like to have a slide like this just to clarify the terminology. I think it's important when we're talking about it. But char, you can see on the left, is really any carbonaceous material produced by pyrolysis. So all of these materials that can potentially be produced by pyrolysis, but it includes natural fires. So we often get a lot of ash within natural fires. Something like charcoal, the intended use of charcoal, which is different than biochar, is as a fuel. And so it's for heating or cooking, and not necessarily or not for environmental or agricultural applications. And it's typically produced from wood. Whereas char, on the other hand, let's say 10, 15 years ago, you might have thought of biochar intended for soil application to improve properties. But that definition of biochar has really evolved over more recent years as the literature and research has increased. And so now it's really intended for more widespread agronomic and agricultural and environmental applications. So it's a definition that's moved beyond solely soil improvement and soil use as a soil amendment, but to include carbon sequestration and carbon storage, as well as other applications. And so that image there is actually a picture of biochar that has been put into building materials as a basically long-term carbon sequestration within buildings and possibly cement materials. And so there are many uses of biochar beyond agriculture. And I'm not obviously going to talk about these today, but I just wanted to put them out there. And so really the focus is biochar and agriculture. So at a basic level, where did this idea come from? Biochar is not new, as many of you know. It's something that's been around for hundreds, thousands of years, and really came out of some excellent research by Johannes Lehmann here at Cornell and others down in the central Amazon, looking at really stable carbon materials, these anthropogenic dark earths, or as they're called there, is terra preta de indigo soils, which are these highly weathered tropical oxisol soils that, through likely the repeated applications of waste materials by indigenous communities, led to more a buildup of carbon or organic matter within these soils and created more fertile soils for crop production. And so these were much higher productivity soils, where in a similar environment, they are typically highly weathered, low productivity soils because they have a low ability to store low fertility, and they don't really retain nutrients and water as well. And the decomposition rate within these environments is much higher. And so we also know there's been a lot of research done that similar soils have really been found all over the world. So through this repeated applications of charred materials, we've gotten these buildup of really great fertility soils throughout the world. And so biochar is really a take on, let's say, an ancient practice. And so there's a lot of potential around biochar, and I think many of you on this webinar today are aware of it. Over the last decade, there have been more than 20,000 publications to some extent on biochar, topics around biochar. And because there have been a lot of research questions, there were a lot of unknowns that we scientists know a lot more today about biochar and its potential. And so this is just some overarching benefits of biochar in various systems. And I will touch upon some of these in the slides. But in saying all of this, one of the things that really limited biochar adoption 10 years ago, when there was all this initial research coming out and kind of this craze around it, is that it's not a silver bullet solution. And there are no silver bullet solutions when it comes to aspects of soil health or climate change. We're talking about using many different tools as part of a much larger management toolbox and integrating these together to reach a certain goal. I do just want to touch upon this, obviously, as Aaron mentioned, talking about climate change and carbon sequestration and building soil organic carbon within our soils, that there's huge potential from biochar for this. There have been a number of studies over the years that have looked at biochar's ability to be a form of long-term carbon storage within our soils and its ability to help reduce anthropogenic CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases within the atmosphere. And it's really one of, if not the only, let's say, carbon negative technology out there, both from its production. If you do a full life cycle assessment of biochar, there is great potential for it to be there is credible for carbon negative technology. I do want to mention that there's been an increase in the potential for biochar entering the carbon removal marketplace. And I'm just putting, not to endorse these companies by any means, but a number of companies there just provided on the bottom that are really interested in looking at biochar, have platforms available for biochar within carbon removal and getting credits around its use. And so going back to the stability of biochar and this long-term carbon sequestration potential of biochar is that it degrades on hundreds to thousands of years timescales. And these are just some general graphics on how, say, can you see? I don't have a pointer. Okay,
yes, yeah,
got it. On the left here, this just kind of an essential stability figure of biochar, just very general, that Johannes had put together over 15 years ago now, on basically that there's a large fraction of the carbon within biochar that remains compared to materials that are uncharred. So we're thinking about composts, crop residues, mulches, organic materials that might be used within soil or applied back to the soil, but are uncharred compared to materials that have gone through the pyrolysis process. And similar, slightly later publication looking at it compared to, all the carbon that's stored within growing a growing tree or some type of woody material. And that rate of degradation is much lower. And so moving forward with some more of the current literature on how those figures have evolved is that biochar is stable, but we know that this is very dependent on the feedstock and production conditions it is produced from. So I realize just looking at these might look like complex figures. There's a lot going on. I'm just going to take a minute to explain them. This one on the left here was a meta-analysis done that was looking at a number of different feedstock materials. You can see those on the bottom here, from crop residues to grasses, manures, being mixed hardwoods, and then this would be a hardwood material. And basically, you can see over time that there's some rate of degradation. So there's there's a part of biochar that degrades very rapidly, like most organic materials, within weeks, months, but over time, and this is over 8 years, that more than, let's say, 88–90% of that carbon, that biochar is remaining within the soil. But it is slightly variable depending on the feedstock used. This figure on the right, I just want to mention this H to C ratio. H to C ratio is an indicator used, and it was evaluated in a number of studies to equate to the stability of biochar in soil environments, and the fact that if you have an H to C ratio of less than 0.4, more than 70% of that biochar remains after 100 years. And that as you get a higher H to C ratio, that stability of biochar, that carbon persistence in the soil decreases. And this is also a function of pyrolysis temperature. And so the higher the pyrolysis temperature, typically the more stable our biochars are. Biochar stability in soils is also directly impacted by biotic and abiotic factors just occurring within the soil environment. And this was just a summary figure from a fairly recent meta-analysis on the various processes that biochar positively or negatively impacts within the soil environment. And obviously, it's important to remember that how biochar reacts is going to differ by the environment, by the climate, by the soil, by the management. I'm going to talk about that in a few slides. So moving on, just thinking about opportunities for biochar production and the scalability of it is, since biochar, it's such a versatile product, it can be produced by a number of different methods. And these are just a few examples of different scales that biochar can be produced, from something as small as a kiln that doubles as a cook stove that could be used within developing countries for smallholder farmers, to kind of farm size, maybe production kilns, larger reactors, mobile units. Mobile units might be one of the most advantageous methods for biochar production, especially within forest environments. It's been something that the U.S. Forest Service has been actively engaged with and interested in to manage wildfires and other things. And also generally, we can think about it within New York State for material and waste management after weather events, when we have a lot of downed trees, or potentially manure management or other waste materials, and the ability to move pyrolysis units to where the waste products are. And then we get other methods on farm, as well as these large scale integrated bioenergy systems, which is where we're getting more of those oils and gases I mentioned before. But biochars overall are incredibly diverse, as I've been saying, and that their properties are impacted by that original feedstock, that original starting material, that woody biomass, that crop residue, that manure, whatever it's produced from, as well as the production conditions. And so I'm just showing a couple images of what I mean by this. On the left, we're looking at the same feedstock. So this was a switchgrass feedstock used to make this biochar, but under different production conditions. A slow pyrolysis, a fast pyrolysis, a gasification. And kind of looking under scanning electron microscope, what the pores, what's the shape sizes of this material looks like. And this is an image on the right that's very commonly used by folks in biochar presentations, and just that diversity of biochars, thinking of potentially more ash content, darker materials. And these can all be processed, they can be ground, they can look more similar, but overall it's important to remember that biochars are not all the same. And how with biochars not being all the same, as I mentioned, their impacts are soil, crop, biochar, environment, and management dependent. And additionally, to add more complexity to that, their properties change over time, and how this impacts the soil environment changes. So if you ever hear the terms fresh versus aged biochars, this has to do with freshly produced biochars that may be directly out of a kiln, or hours, days old, versus materials that have either been lying around and been exposed to rainfall events, temperature fluctuations, or they've been applied within the soil and they've degraded to some extent, they've been exposed to microbial activity. And so their impacts change. And there was a recent meta-analysis done by Joseph and others just last year that did a nice summary of how these impacts change within the first weeks, months, and then years. But unfortunately, this complexity and the variability and the changing of biochar properties over time is one of the main reasons that it hasn't been widely adopted so far, especially within agricultural systems, because we don't want to introduce more risk to farmers and producers in already an inherently risky environment. One of the things that has been really important within helping reduce this variability and potential risk to producers is certification and standards. So the IBI, the International Biochar Initiative, in 2013, actually, so almost a decade ago, created a certification and basically a standards program around biochar. And the idea of this was to verify, or the idea behind this really is to verify that biochar materials have met certain standards, property standards, and went through toxicity tests that confirm they're safe for the use for soil applications. And this takes into account that diversity of biochar, and this is really a quality assurance program. However, it's voluntary, and currently it's not directly, there's no direct US program, although obviously there's a lot of discussion amongst the biochar community of developing one. And this is really important, I think, to guarantee that the biochars are safe and there won't be any detrimental effects to the soil upon application. And I think this is important. I had a conversation with someone a number of months ago about potential, biochar building up heavy metals in soils, and that it actually increased heavy metals, and biochars that are tested and have a certification label will not have this impact. So I think this is very important to make sure we're producing, or biochars are being produced that are high quality and that will have a benefit and not be detrimental when used. And also, when we think about biochar quality and materials, it's important to think about what problem you're trying to solve as a producer or producers you might be working with. Just like any material, and we think about lime or fertilizer, we're applying that because we know there's an issue. We know there's a problem, whether our pH is low or our crops are lacking fertility. And so when a producer says maybe they want to use biochar, or you're providing recommendations, it's, I think, very important to ask, what are you trying to solve? Why do you want to use biochar? Are you looking for that carbon sequestration? Are you looking to build organic matter? Are you having issues with nutrients or water retention within your soil? So thinking about what is the purpose of applying biochar to your fields, or when working with producer, why do they want to use biochar? We're not just applying it to apply it, right? There's a cost around it. And so getting at that cost and the availability around biochar, that while availability is improving and increasing, and there are facilities that are not within New York, or let's say on the East Coast, producing around 50 tons a day of biochar, that's increasing. Production is increasing, but at the scale that farmers need it, is still very limited. And especially when we think of sourcing local, we're not producing it at the amount that farms really need it. And this has been another reason for limited adoption. And also the cost. As more biochar producers come on the market, as we increase awareness to all stakeholders and farmers about the benefits of biochar, the cost is going down. It has already gone down a lot. These are just some examples of some pricings of biochar, and can we get this down to under $200 an acre or a ton? And also, as technology has improved, we're getting better consistency of biochar products. And also, there are many opportunities to work directly with manufacturers of biochar around the selection of particular feedstock or any pre or post processing treatments. And this is something that we get out with this idea of designer biochars. It's a term that came in the literature over a decade ago, of basically creating biochars for specific end uses, for specific purposes. And also many have probably heard of blending, charging, inoculating, or co-composting biochars. And I'm going to talk about this in a few slides, but this has become very important when we think about biochar, or this newer idea of biochar-based fertilizers. So that biochar material itself being a relatively inert material, as I mentioned in the beginning, basically a carbon backbone. But can that carbon backbone, in acting like a sponge, hold fertilizers, hold nutrients? Can it be pre-treated and pre-charged to then have greater benefit when applied to the soil environment? And the last thing around availability and cost is really, it's the transportation of biochar that's very expensive. And it also emits CO2 when we're thinking about a technology where we're trying to sequester CO2 and build carbon within our soils. So it's very important for a sustainable biochar industry to source local and obviously from feedstocks that are waste materials. Biochar and soil health, obviously, I know many folks on this call are within the soil world, soil scientists or extension folks, and have a big interest in soil health. I just am going to put some summary points up here around what has been found on how biochar benefits soil health and the impacts it has, whether directly or indirectly within the soil environment. But I will once again emphasize it as part of the toolbox. So obviously I'm not going to repeat what's listed on this page, but I do want to mention that the overall impacts of biochar within soil are positive. If we look at the many meta-analysis that are out there today, and I will show on the next slide, a systematic review of meta-analyses, that the impacts are overall positive on many aspects of soil properties, and particularly within sandier soils or highly weathered soils, we see tremendous benefits. And so this is a really great summary image that was made last year, and this is the systematic review of 20 different meta-analysis. So now we have enough data within the biochar world, there's over 20,000 publications on biochar, to create meta-analyses on different topics. And so I just want within this slide to look at the top bars here, which is the impacts on plant productivity, crop yield, and then crop yield when we look at this biochars plus fertilizer. And overall, we see a positive impact of about 10% on crop yields with biochar applications. And this is review of thousands of publications and studies, trials that have been done using biochar. And there are a host of other, obviously, benefits from biochar on microbial activity, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, nutrient availability. So this is an excellent paper if anyone is interested in diving deeper. And so when we think about biochar application rates, and this is always the question I get when I'm speaking with farmers or talking with stakeholders, well, how much do we apply? You know, if we have a perfect answer, we wouldn't be talking today, basically, because the issue is it depends and it's variable. And there's a lot of evidence that applying too much may be detrimental. And so through these meta-analysis and plenty of papers and the overall positive impact on crop yield, I'm just showing here some of the rates that have been found within these meta-analysis across a range of environments. So we're not just talking temperate soils like we have here in New York, but we're talking about tropical soils as well. Typically, I often say that not to go over 10 tons per acre. I've seen some excellent benefits at 10 tons per acre, obviously when that biochar is co-composted. But if we start to get higher, then these numbers, we actually you can see a drop off in yield or negative impacts. And this may have to do in part to nutrient immobilization in the soil as one example, but there are many others out there. And so, as I mentioned, that the evidence from more and more papers has supported the fact that we need to inoculate or charge or create essentially bio-based fertilizers, where biochar is the backbone for more nutrients to be added to the soil. And this gets at really moistening that material before application, because there could potentially be some safety concerns around inhalation, because biochars itself are very light materials. So just a few comments on what I've been mentioning of biochar-based fertilizers, and just a few meta-analysis that have come out that have summarized dozens and dozens of studies out there, that basically the effect of biochar is improved when it's combined with fertilizer. The impacts on yields have been shown to be greater in general crop productivity, as well as resistance to biotic and abiotic factors. You can see at the bottom here that these impacts have been lower within temperate environments compared to tropical environments. And I'm going to expand on this in a little bit. But also when we think of biochar-based fertilizers, and we think of the cost of raw biochars versus some other materials, that biochars are still relatively expensive compared to other nutrients or nutrient sources out there. So more economical to use lower amounts of biochar and add nutrients to it. What I mentioned there of designer-based biochar, so working directly with a producer to create a biochar for your intended end use. And then some methods that have been proposed within the literature around how we can produce these and have the nutrients with the biochar in the material before application. And when we think of biochar-based fertilizers, just bringing it back to New York here, that manure-derived biochars, especially within our state, have a huge potential. And there's a lot of research going on by Johannes here at Cornell and his group on manure-derived biochars. So can we create the massive dairy waste products and pyrolyze those and put those back in a more stable form to our farm fields, and also reduce the amount of actual manure in terms of volume applied back to the environment. And so just listing a few points around that here, and one of the biggest challenges in this area has been obviously the moisture content within manure materials. But there's a lot of potential and a lot of research going in this area right now. There are also, this was some social science research recently done by a master's student at the University of Albany, just looking at some farmer perspectives around biochar use and adoption, and why farmers within New York State are not adopting biochar yet, or if they are. So this was a very small sample size, only 36 farmers responded to the survey, but this gives you some idea of where interest in biochar use on farms is. So overall, there are more farmers that are interested in using biochar than are not. And maybe not sure has to do about increasing awareness and understanding of biochar itself and its many potential benefits. And so these were just some of the main barriers identified within this study, specifically from New York State producers. Some other ones that have been identified overall in other work of why growers are not adopting biochar. I've listed here. Many have already discussed the diversity and site specificity around biochar, that complexity when it's applied to the in-soil environment. Awareness, just more research needs, although there's been a tremendous amount of research done in the last decade. The cost, availability, assistance, and the need for decision support tools, which I'm going to mention all of these very quickly in the next 10 minutes or so before questions. So we know, while there are barriers to adoption, that there are producers of biochar within New York State and farmers using biochar. And these are across various commodities, but the applications and the uses still tend to be within our higher value specialty crops, within horticultural medias, and ornamental plantings. This is just a picture of biochar that I had seen delivered to a vegetable operation. We know it's being used within urban agriculture, and because it's such a lightweight material, can it be used within the soil or the organic material used on rooftop farms where weight is a very important issue, and perennial cropping systems. This was a picture I took actually this summer, looking at an orchard, and also being applied within vineyards and other tree systems. And also, I do want to put a plug for USDA NRCS coming out with a financial assistance or a cost share program around biochar and other soil carbon amendments, and for growers within New York State. That this was standard 808 as the interim standard, but is now 336. So for any growers here interested in potentially applying for assistance around using biochar and other soil amendments, speak with NRCS about this. And it's important that it addresses a resource concern. As I mentioned before, we're not, just supplying biochar to apply it, but what is our intended purpose there? And this is really getting at lowering the economic barriers to biochar adoption and recognizing that it is still fairly expensive. I just want to spend a few minutes looking at showing some application methods of biochar in various environments, and that there are many different ways to use and apply biochar within agricultural systems. On the left here is a much larger scale application to field crops. This is actually out in Iowa, where I did my graduate work, looking at large scale field applications within corn systems and the incorporation. And then this is smaller scale. These are just some images from a research trial that I had conducted of manually applying the biochar within already established systems. So there are different ways to use it. I will emphasize that some type of incorporation of biochar is needed because it is such a lightweight material. It will leave fields by wind or water if it is not incorporated to some extent. Other ways that it can be utilized are within manure spreaders, within side discharge spreaders or roll mulchers. This was a really great picture. I had a conversation with a producer out on the West Coast, and they were actually incorporating biochar, mixing their dry biochar with a dry fertilizer and putting that through a no-seed or no-till drill and getting it incorporated down into the soil, which is really, really important. So it's very versatile. A few other images and ways that can be applied. Probably a great interest here may be the liquid injection. So there are producers, or when you make biochar, essentially you can create a very fine biochar material and suspend it within water or some other liquid material and spread that. Whether you're top dressing, this is on turf grass, within golf courses, but it can be used within manure applications as well. Now getting to where to apply biochar and where most of the evidence have been around its benefits. Not to say that the impacts there have not been impacts within temperate environments, but the impacts have largely been found within more degraded soils, or let's say low fertility, sandier soils. So the greatest benefits have been within tropical systems, but we do see benefits within temperate environments. We do see benefits on farms. I've seen them here in New York and elsewhere. And so this image is just some great work from a colleague that did an overall modeling of the US, and basically where would we get the effective yields by biochar impacts, and this was biochar applications, and this was looking at 15 megagrams per hectare of a biochar, of a hardwood biochar applied in the US. And in red, the positive potential impact on yield would be lower, and in green we would see a higher potential impact on yield. And so from that bigger just kind of national map there, within this study, they looked specifically at the Central Valley within California. And I know some of you on this call have heard me talk about this before, but basically the main point I want to show here is that we can link up soil properties with the potential for a positive impact from biochar. And so we know in lower pH soils, more acidic soils, and we apply biochars, which tend to be more basic and have a liming effect, that at least within the short term, especially, that we see an increase in pH, and this usually immediately may lead to some type of yield increase. And so the Central Valley is it's a great example because it's such an agricultural area, agriculturally focused area, and there's distinct soil properties from the west to the east side of the Central Valley. So we can think about on the east side, the pH is slightly more acidic. We have lower organic matter values, and we have a lower CEC. Therefore, the potential response of biochar is greater when we have those poor soil quality indicators. Whereas on the west side of the Central Valley, where we have a slightly higher pH, we already have higher organic matter, the CEC is higher, the potential for a positive impact from biochar tends to be lower. Not to say there wouldn't be a benefit, but the benefits are likely not to be as high. So to summarize what I just said, I put up that slide. And so coming to New York, this is some work I've been doing with that same colleague to try and identify areas within New York State specifically where we may have the greatest application or potential impacts of biochar. And this is really looking at soil suitability and connecting the soil properties with crop and biochar parameters. And I've showed this map before. I'm currently working on looking at different application rates, different biochar types, and looking at this maybe at a more regional scale. But we can see more green, equals the higher potential for a positive impact of biochar within the soil. So there are lots of places where biochar can be utilized within New York State. Some helpful tools I just want to point out to growers and others around biochar is that the IBI had created a number of years ago a biochar classification tool that basically equates biochar properties that you may get from a laboratory report, and you can enter those in and get a fertilizer grade, a fertilizer equivalent of that biochar. So that might be helpful for producers when thinking about, okay, I don't know what all these nutrient values mean within a biochar analysis, but I know when I think about their fertilizer equivalent, how much nitrogen or phosphorus am I going to get from that biochar material? Another one that was recent that has come from folks at the USDA, which is great and really exciting. And as I think about that analysis I'm working on for New York State, this is a larger national tool, was that within the Web Soil Survey tool, they put the dynamic soil properties response to biochar. So this is getting at that idea of where we have lower quality soils, are the impacts of biochar are likely to be greater. And so it color codes that area of interest within a field, on where within that field, based on soil type, will we get a better response from biochar. And there's some assumptions within this model of that a corn stover and plus manure feedstock is applied by minimal incorporation with tillage. So I assume some type of broadcast application. And that there are ratings from excellent to basically unsuitable for biochar applications. While this is a great tool and a next step for producers, there are some limitations that I've seen, and you know, there are going to be many iterations, I'm sure, of this tool, of thinking about different application rates of biochar. I don't know what they assume within this, and maybe some of the USDA folks on this call can answer it. Different biochar types, so other biochar feedstocks, excuse me, and then the persistence around biochar. So how long are the benefits going to last? And so just to summarize, because I've been speaking for way too long and I do want to leave some time for questions, just a kind of overall summary of the potential for biochar to improve soil health and overall agricultural production within New York State and beyond. And just to remember that it's not a silver bullet solution, but there are many other tools that it should be integrated with into a soil health management toolbox on farms. And so I know that was a very quick overview, and I touched upon a lot of different topics and didn't dive very deep into them, but hopefully there's some time for questions. And thanks again, Aaron and American Farmland Trust.
Thank you, Debbie. That was excellent presentation and was exactly what I was looking for. So there is a lot of information out there. So I think you covered the basics very well. So thank you. So just for the CCA credits, oops, I do not, sorry about that. For the CCA credits, I did post it in the chat for the tracking number and also the QR code link. So so it's there if you need it. And then also one question that was asked is, where will this be made available? So it will be posted on the Genesee River Demonstration Farm Network webpage, and I did provide a link there. But also, if you just type into Google Genesee River Demo Farm Network, you'll get a link. So it'll be posted there. All right. So we do have a few minutes here. So yeah, we could have some questions, and I'm totally fine either way. If you are comfortable with a verbal question, that's great, or you can type it into chat and we'll address it. So who would like to be the icebreaker here and ask a question?
There is one question that just
there is, sorry,
right now. So that's a very so the question is, do you know how New York State open burn laws play into making biochar? I don't know exactly, and I'm not really the person to answer that. I do know that there are permitting requirements around biochar production, and that there's the New York DEC is trying at this stage to figure out how to both, let's say, classify biochar and also look at kind of the emissions around it as well. So I don't even know if they have anything on their website but I think that may be a question for the DEC, or maybe someone else on this call knows, but I'm not sure off the top of my head. But I know there are fairly stringent permitting requirements around producing biochar. But then again, of course, it depends on the scale of production.
Okay, any other questions? Got a few minutes left here.
I do also want to put just mention that there are a lot of resources out there around biochar, and a lot of different groups have pages up with biochar information. I just want to put a plug for making sure that if you are getting information around biochar, that is from a reliable source. The IBI, the International Biochar Initiative, or the USBI, which is the United States Biochar Initiatives, have excellent resources on their website of biochar. I'm also working on putting together a resource page on the New York Soil Health webpage, and that will be released pretty soon, hopefully in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, we do have another question. We have two questions now, so that's probably all we have time for. If you do put any more questions in, I'll direct those to Debbie, and maybe she could answer them personally to you. So what is the temperature of burning that's required to make biochar? That's the question.
Yeah, so it's produced from a wide range of production conditions. So there's everything from slow pyrolysis to fast pyrolysis to gasification. Typically above, most biochars are definitely made above 350 degrees Celsius. Probably 450 over 500 degrees Celsius is better. When we start to get it to gasification, it's about 1500 to 2000 degrees Celsius. But let's say optimum maybe within that 500 to 1000 degree range. But if you're making it on farm at a very small scale, those temperatures are likely to be more variable and lower. But that production condition temperature and the residence time, which is that amount of time for which that biochar is at that highest heating temperature, will impact those formation of the aromatic carbon bonds and its persistence in the soil. You mentioned using switchgrass. Is there any potential research being done on using invasive biomass, knotweed, stiltgrass, as a feedstock? That's a really great question. And yes, actually, I did my master's dissertation looking at biochar produced from an invasive biomass. And so, yes, there is research in that. I don't know specifically for those species, but certainly there is. And if you send me an email, I can follow up with some research papers. But definitely that is a sustainable feedstock, and helps with waste management as well. Yeah, and Aaron put up my email there. So if you do have any follow-up questions or want clarity on anything I mentioned today, or more information from my slides because they were really summary, I'd be happy to follow up at any point.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Debbie. That was wonderful, and this is a new technology, so it's great to get this basic introductory information out. So I appreciate your time, and thanks everyone for joining us. Please feel free to email me or Debbie if you have any more questions. And other than that, everyone enjoy your day. Thank you.